Hey, Sahit.
Hi, Ranjit.
Hi, how are you?
Very well, very well. And
Fabulous.
we are both on time, and we are. And
Absolutely.
I see you're sporting a new look.
I just shaved basically.
Yes, 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 yes. And so we are just waiting for. We are actually a minute ahead of time.
We are
So
indeed.
let's just wait for people to join in. And
Sounds great.
but I was just I just had a question to start off, to sort of start off the
Sure.
session in a softer way, which is
Right.
how has this time of lockdown been treating you?
Well, I have to say, despite the ambient anxieties which we've all gone through, uh, it's not been a very different kind of life. I mean, as a writer, in any case, I spend a lot of time quietly sequestrated, if that's the right word, in solitude, working on my writing, reading, listening to music. So from that point of view, I haven't felt cut off from things. But of course, there are
Right.
things that I think we all miss. The fact that you can't go to bookstores or libraries, you can't see family and friends. Uh, there's 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 been that sort of sense of being in a space station, more or less, which reminds
That's
me
a
of that.
beautiful
No, I don't know
that's
if
a
you remember,
beautiful way
there
of
was,
putting it.
at the time the Soviet Union melted down, they people seem to have forgotten about the one cosmonaut who was orbiting the Earth in a space station, and it
Yes.
took about a year for everybody to get together and bring him back to Baikonur. So I've often in these months wondered how he dealt with that situation of being alone, wondering if he'd ever come back to Earth. So it's been frightening from that point of view. But also from the
Absolutely.
point of view of how all the catastrophes that have been building up in the last 2 or 3 decades have come to a head. It should be a wake up call, but I have a sinking feeling that it's not going to be a wake up call for states and corporations and influential networks that should really have got the point of what's happened.
So true, so true, so true. And it is, of course, it is a good day to meditate on this or to think about this, because today is, of course, 15th August. Today is India's Independence Day, when we worry, when we look back to what we've gained and what we've lost. But let me start off
True.
the session in a formal way with by welcoming people, and by welcoming you. Welcome to this special PEN Prithvi Insta Live session. I call it special for two reasons. One is because of the occasion, it is Indian Independence Day. And of course, because we have a very, very special poet, cultural theorist, and independent curator with us today, Mr. Ranjit Hoskote. Ranjit Hoskote requires no introduction. We all know him very well, and we are all very familiar with his work. But just for form's sake, let me introduce him with a brief bio. Ranjit Hoskote's 7 collections of poetry include Vanishing Acts, Central Time, Jonah Bale, and most recently the Atlas of Lost Beliefs, published by ARC in the UK. His translation of a celebrated 14th century Kashmiri woman mystics poetry has appeared as I, Lala, the Poems of Lal Ded. Hoskote curated India's first ever national pavilion at the Venice Biennale under the title Everyone Agrees It's About to Explode. He has been honored with the Sahitya Akademi Golden Jubilee Award and the Sahitya Akademi Translation Award. Hoskote's poems have been translated into German, Hindi, Bangla, Marathi, Irish Gaelic, Swedish, Spanish, and Arabic. I would like to say that what I really, really admire about this bio and about indeed Ranjit's work is that it is his many careers, if you like, are the antithesis of a sort of hyper specialization into which many of us find ourselves straitjacketed. He executes multiple adjacent functions. He is a prolific and major poet. He's a curator of exhibitions that have proved significant, and he's a cultural theorist. a multiplicity of intersecting pursuits that make me question the near universality of super specialization to the exclusion of one's multiple talents. But of course, today we are here to explore and enjoy Ranjit's poetry. Welcome, Ranjit, to this Extra Live, and it's a real privilege to have you with us today.
Thank you so much, Sohit. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I'm really so pleased that PEN Prithvi is now on Instagram. It's in a new medium, and it's reaching out to many more people than was possible when it was a physically situated platform. That has its own intimacy and its own beauty. And
Yeah.
there should be a way of combining these, I think. I'm also just truly happy, truly grateful for the people that I see are joining. Thank you all for being here this evening. Suhit, and thank you very much for your very gracious and generous words of welcome. It's good to be here, and on this day.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And which brings us to this question, which is, how are we going to start off this evening? It's a poetry reading session, and as our viewers probably know by now, we try to foreground the poet as much as possible, so I'll keep my comments to a minimum. But how do you want to begin this evening? How would you like to set the stage, so to say?
Well, what I would like to do, and Mustansir Dalvi has come in with perfect timing, because what I thought I would do is to read as a sort of invocation the first stanza of a truly great poem by somebody who is being translated by Mustansir right now. I will read the Urdu. This is really from Faiz Ahmed Faiz. It's a poem that many of you will be familiar with, Subh-e Azadi, written in August 1947. So in a sense, it's a foundational poem. Speaks both to the fact of independence, but also the cost at which it was achieved and how it still remains to be fully achieved. So this is, I'll read the first stanza. Subh-e Azadi. Ye daag daag ujala, ye shab gazida seher, wo intizar tha jiska, ye wo seher to nahi, ye wo seher to nahi jiski arzu lekar chale the yaar, ke mil jayegi kahin na kahin, falak ke dasht mein taron ki aakhri manzil, kahin to hoga shabe sust mauj ka sahil, kahin to jaake rukega safina e gham e dil.
Wow.
And this has been strongly present for me in the last few months. This poem, the question of how independence remains yet a work in progress, something to be achieved against all odds, and the odds are stacking up. And yet we need to keep this in mind, to remember
Absolutely.
what we have gone through in South Asia to get to this point. And I say South Asia because we are all, the countries of South Asia, we are all in this together.
Absolutely, absolutely so. And what a lovely way to begin the evening, to set the tone and tenor for the evening. I am also, this country has seen so much ferment, especially in the past 2 years. People on the streets, people on various fora, and of course, this Faiz poem has been. I've actually seen it being read out on the streets along with other poets such as Rahat Indori, who left us recently.
True.
And it really is a testament to how, in times of such extreme circumstances, poetry really sort of proves to be the thing, the lifeline that we reach for, something that our lodestone that we keep touching every now and then, gain energy from. And it is, of course, an evening of poetry. So may I request you to read out your own work at this time?
Sure, I will. What I thought I'd do, Suhit, is really to course through the last 3 or 4 books. And maybe I'll begin with a few poems from Vanishing Acts, which was the new and selected poems which came out in 2006. And I'm going to start with a poem called Trespasser's Song. It's dedicated to a friend, a poet and an architect who has now lived in Canada for more than 20 years. And the origin of the poem is really an afternoon at the National Center for Performing Arts, where the place was under renovation. And suddenly it came to me that a quiet city, an abandoned city, is a place of alienation and fear. And that's how the city has seemed to me in these last few months as well. So this is the poem. It goes like this. Trespassers Song. Picture this city in reverse. The arches dim, the domes bulge and turn. People back away from you, smiling. A crow skirls, dragged back in time. The wind's an elastic band drawn tight by unseen hands that push past you and place a red skull and crossbones sign 3 steps from the glass door you were about to open. A concrete mixer grinds its teeth and groans. But before the stone lion on the stair can add his role to the chorus, a boy gags him with a black rag that began life as a crow. The gatekeeper's on holiday. Warnings rule. Between you and the rubble of the construction site, this one splits your shadow. Danger. Road closed.
Wow. Wow. Wow.
Thank you.
I could actually visualize the scene that you were painting, especially since the NCPA is such a dear place to the cultural community of Bombay.
Yeah, and I thought I'd now move to another poem from this book, and it's called Landscapes with Saints. This comes also from a time when I was really in the thick of my translation of Lal Ded, and was thinking about the larger context of mystical poetry in the subcontinent. And the aphoristic, epigrammatic quality, the sudden wisdom that can appear as much as a slap as a pat, that was very present to me. So Landscapes with Saints, which is, my math is terrible, so I have to count how many verses there are. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There are 7. There are 7 verses. And each is devoted to a particular saint. And it goes like this. Mean as knives, his burnished limbs rotted and stank when the gateman came to call his number. Gorak forgot. His body was just a borrowed suit, one size too large. He's forgotten the river pilot's song. He's above parrot gossip, beyond the hawk's warning cry, wrapping himself in the torn fabric of sky. Kabir climbs on. Dropping his nimbus in the grass, he looks at the boats riding the stream below, close enough to touch. When the road ends, Tukha takes a deep breath and leaps. She sees a boatman rowing in sand, shielding his skiff from the ocean's roar. Such a safe harbor, brother, sings Lala. It saves you the trouble of charting your course. His eyes would not rest on a quatrain of walls and scanned the desert air instead. Mango trees balancing on their heads. Himself, Khushru, a bird of paradise, judged by earth. Neglect leafs through his pages. Perfumes escape from files left unstoppered on his shelves. Lead crumbles in Attar's mind. His hands, wherever they rest, touch gold. A torn cotton robe against the wind, his limbs nettle pricked, transparent as prayers. His name burnt out, Milarepa sings to himself as he travels the centuries.
Wow. Utterly
I'm so glad you
beautiful.
say wow. What's that? Say it.
I said it was utterly beautiful, and I was, by a strange coincidence, I was just thinking of Milarepa today, and
Of course, because of your own
how
work.
he transitioned from being quite a dubious character to being, of course, this man of some spiritual attainment. So tremendous
Absolutely.
arc there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the reason I said I was glad to hear Ba is because it reminds me of something Shahid used to say, Aga Shahid Ali, whose father, Aga Ashraf Ali, unfortunately left us a few days ago. So
Oh yes.
it's a terrible loss. Both father and son were very special, amazing presences. And Shahid used to say that the thing he misses in Anglophone readings, which of course you have in Urdu and Hindi, people don't say wow. They used to say they sit like people at at some highly formal occasion, Victorian, no expression, and so
Yes.
forth. But here we are. So what I'm going to read next, Suhit, is a poem called The Surveyor's Complaint. I'm kind of exploring further this engagement with landscape, with terrain, with fact of place, and what we bring to it. The Surveyor's Complaint. What is land but the wry code left to be broken at the map's edge, a challenge deferred to another day's work in mist and rain, or left to bleach through a summer of trumpets, a dream lost to measurement, found again in heavy leaves, fallen like keys on the doorstep. My fear of houses is about leaving, the shutting of doors, the creaking of hinges, the fastening of bolts, the snapping of latches, pausing at the step before taking a train, moving on. My fear of houses is about folding places up, putting them away. In a province not my own, my gifts begin to work. Tractor, cloud, bridge across the river, activated by degrees, slurry pouring into sinks from which houses should grow, oranges gathered and heaped up, the landscape itself like a stalled engine growling to life.
Utterly beautiful.
Thank you so much.
Utterly beautiful. And such
So
vivid folding faces and such beautiful images.
which strangely also reminds me, although that's not what I was thinking of at the time, is another artist who was very, very dear to me. It was an honor for me to show her at the first ever National Pavilion at the Venice Biennale that we had, Zarina Hashmi. She also left us earlier this year, and Zarina was very, very special. And given her nomadic, diasporic life, the house that one could fold up and carry off, the wheeled house, the house on wheels, these were recurrent motifs in her work. I never thought of it before, but really it was probably also in my mind.
I was just,
it's funny. Sorry, I keep interrupting you.
No, that's fine. I was just thinking it's funny that you should mention an artist and the Venice Biennale, because I was wondering very vividly that if a painter were to be commissioned to paint the motifs in this poem, it would it would be very rhizomic in that sense, because all the motifs really work together. But they are not part of. They are not one scene. They're a theme, but they're not a scene together. But they all work together in a beautiful way.
Thank you. I'm glad to have that response. I really have to say that there was a time in my childhood when everybody thought that I would be a painter someday, because painting is really what I was absolutely obsessed with. I used to lock myself away and paint and read. I was a very boring child, so this is what I used to do. But eventually, it turned out that as I began to write on the visual arts, which I began to do also rather early in the day, I did less and less of that. So I've very occasionally gone back to making collages or paintings now. But for the most part, I admire the paintings and drawings and collages and installations and sculptures of others. So, but it's true that my poetry does have this very strong commitment to the visual. And it was only the other day that I realized how privileged some of us were in what people take to be the bad old days before the liberalization of being exposed to absolutely marvelous cinema. Rai, Ghatak, and numerous other masters here, but also world cinema. I was thinking of Istvan Sabo, Andre Weide, Werner Herzog, Schlondorf, Wim Wenders, the kinds of European cinema that we grew up seeing as well. And looking back at it, I can't help but think that that sense of magisterial choreography, the baroque beauty of some of these things, also the openness to a landscape, to the sky, all this, went into certainly my consciousness rather early, in my early teens, and it's something I would like to pay homage to as well.
That's so wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that. It allows us to understand, one more layer in your rich work. What would you like to read next?
I think I might move on to a book called Central Time. To me, of course, everything looks reversed. I'm assuming it comes across to people. This is a hall of mirrors. We're in the hall of mirrors, so it's quite lovely. So I'll begin with actually the first poem in the book, in Central Time, and it's called Platform Directions. And is about being in a slight state of bafflement in an art space. It's set in a museum of contemporary art called the Hamburger Bahnhof in Berlin, which was once, and not for a long time, a railway station. So it still retains this sense of robust 19th century Central European train station, but it's not. So Platform Directions, Hamburger Bahnhof, Berlin. Here's how you solve the riddles this train station poses. When you come in from the sun, wristwatch stopped, looking for shade under cool timetables. Start by walking around. Stare at a pyramid you cannot enter. Look through an igloo made of glass and numbers. Or test the runway laid out for a plane that could never take off. It taxis around a circle of broken stones. Now try the ramp that leads to a library of lead books, their pages stapled down, and a strong lens provided to blur the missing author's words. Someone's marked their favorite passages with dried poppy seeds. You're pulling on your coat, hefting your rucksack. But where's the rush, my friend? Have a cappuccino while you wait. You can take your time at the station. No train stops here. No train ever leaves.
Wow, wow, wow. Absolutely beautiful. Absolutely.
And I'll go on. Thank you, Suhit. This also was a way of thinking about how one might be baffled in a productive way by sculptures, by installations, by poems. Because all of us who have been concerned with poetry have grown up with this widespread sense that the arts are strange, they're forbidding, they do not welcome or do not invite engagement. But the reverse is true. I think as people involved in the arts, we really need to be far more invitational, for one thing. And we also need to, as we are now doing, to be able to talk about poems or paintings or sculptures in a way where we bring people into the discourse. I think it's a very defensive and unproductive thing to try and seal these things within expert culture. It's completely useless, because art is emancipation. The arts are meant to emancipate the imagination. And on Independence Day, we need to commit ourselves to a variety of forms of emancipation. So that's how I approach the arts.
Absolutely so. Absolutely so.
And I'm going to read now a poem called Giant Malabar Squirrel. It's set in Anuradhapura in Sri Lanka. Really, it was written, rarely do I write a poem at one shot and it's all in place. This was more or less like that. It was written when we visited Sri Lanka in the autumn of 2002. Not that you notice autumn or any of the seasons the closer you get to the equator. But it was a very fragile ceasefire in the terrible, terrible civil war that racked the island and ended, as we know, in great tragedy. So it was an experience of being in South Asia, in a culture that seemed to have much in common with us, but which was highly distinctive. So as someone from India, particularly, I felt a great responsibility in terms of releasing myself to this place and giving it the respect that it called for. But here was an encounter with an animal there, and told us something about the situation. Giant Malabar squirrel, Anuradhapura, large and motionless as a jackfruit about to fall. He hung off the banyan for minutes, head pointing earthward, unmindful of gravity and the body's natural justice. Brush-tailed ambassador of the higher branches, his back unblessed by the triple stripe of Rama's grateful fingers, his stare a declaration of war. He ignored the shelled nuts and coconut flesh that we held out, waited for us to back off, climb back on the bus that had brought us there. Through our tinted windows, we saw him blur down the bark and spring, forepaws gripping the earth, nostrils dilated for hostile smells. Behind his bristling tail, the stupa rose, chalk white, ripe in the center of our eyes, blinding at noon.
Wow. One thing I've noticed about many of your poems, I mean, one hates to generalize, is that the ending line, it often has a, it doesn't lead towards a fixed, there's a full stop there, but there's a full stop is, there's no emphatic end. It seems to lead off into suggestive realms, so
Right.
to say.
This is really, it is, it's actually amazing you should say that, Suvit, because it's something that through the early part of my writing, I worked with, because there was always a certain pressure to come to the grand concluding.
Yeah.
But every poem, I think for all of us, every poem is really en route to another poem and to other questions. So what I prize about form increasingly now is a way of bringing round to a certain sort of finish the present meditation, but to leave it open to what might come next. I think that these are infinite projects, whether we are poets or painters or filmmakers. We are constantly on our way to elsewhere. I think it also has something to do with my very early sense of the visceral importance of the journey. I've always felt somewhat restless, which also probably is why I move among languages and among forms. And also the reason why in the last few years particularly, I've been, as you know, we've talked about this, I've been discontented with the form of the short lyric poem. You might want to call it the Khanda Kavya. You might want to trace its origin to the tradition of the English lyric poem. But that personal I, those particular anxieties proper to oneself, they're not very tenable at a time when we are caught up with planet-wide problems, questions, predicaments. It's, we're all in the thrall of the butterfly effect. Something that happens in the Amazon Delta can affect us here. Something that happens in the Arctic affects us here. Something that happens here affects people very far away. So how might the poem, a relatively modest and unambitious undertaking, how might that open up to this plural I, a we, a kaleidoscopic we? These are the questions I've really been thinking through. So in that sense, the poems also take their place in a kind of ongoing procession of poems.
That's a beautiful way to really look at it, and it makes us think about the role of the personal I and the collective I, if there's such a thing. But
yeah.
So to proceed, how would you like to proceed now that we're at the halfway mark?
Oh, we're at the halfway.
What would
I
you
was
like
about to say I'm terrible with time, so we have to be aware of. So what kind of time do I have? Do I have a
So we have
Couple.
about 20 minutes left.
Okay, great. So why don't I maybe read one or two poems more, and then we can let me read some now from Jonah Whale.
Jonah Bell.
Yeah, I'm gonna read two. They're not companion pieces, but they kind of work together in some way. So I'm going to read. I'm going to start with a poem called Highway Prayer, and it goes like this: Highway Prayer. If you're writing a fresh anthem for the one scorched island marooned in cyclone country, be sure to put in a line about burnt tires and sleeping dogs, and another line on the flags, curtains, TV screens, more flags, all the shrouds the islanders are hanging up to protect themselves from the world. They need a savior. That'll be the man in the red raincoat, falling through an open door. An unseen hand stops him, props him up. He blocks the door, a crucifix barring the passage of time. Time burns right through him. He clutches at his burst stomach, crouching on the sidewalk, holding fast to the creased memory of a river he once loved. In him the shimmer is great, greater than panic, greater than the fear of flies, of stakes, of exploding shells, of ending up as roadkill. Tongue-tied he reads this Rosetta of violence, this highway across which sirens call to knotted prophets, batmen to jokers, jets to sharks. Bless me ivories, the land pirate says, at last shiver me timbers. In this place that found me empty, in this place that found me parched, I am blood, I am grief, I am the returning rocket, I am contrary to the Commonwealth, Lord of the booming antlers on a yellow signboard. Let go, he calls out, let go, craft me into this totality that never closes.
Wow.
And maybe I'll read a couple more if I've got the time.
Yes, yes, yes.
This is probably not the sort of thing one should read on Independence Day. But on the other hand, the way we've been going, it probably is the right thing to read. It's called Hangman's Song. A tired man will hang at dawn for hearing voices in his head. Tomorrow's newspapers won't be read, and the Republic will sleep peacefully. The Rottweilers have been taken off the leash. They are nosing out children in the dark. Tomorrow's joggers will stumble in the park, and the Republic will sleep peacefully. A white crow settles on a branch, stripped of its leaves, which boys shred. The flayed rain trees will soon be dead, and the Republic will sleep peacefully. The lion's open mouth is foaming. His keepers have foraged for flesh all night. They will pile up their plunder at first light, and the Republic will sleep peacefully. A man is horsewhipped for bringing the sky into a cold room without after or before. They will nail his shadow to the door, and the Republic will sleep peacefully. A man swings like a broken clapper in a bell. The hangman knows all but cannot tell. The Republic must sleep peacefully.
My God, that was just so arresting. It was, and as you said, it really speaks to the spirit of the times that the Republic is passing through.
Yeah, true.
When a rumor and a murmur can get one behind bars,
Absolutely.
and in a very in a sense that is not so much Kafkan as it is worse than that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
because one, at least in a Kafkan time, one needs to tell lies against Joseph K for him to get arrested.
True.
Here, there is just a notion, really, a fantasy
Yeah.
that can get one.
Absolutely.
So it's a
Absolutely.
beautiful poem, really, that speaks to all these moods, that gathers all these moods, and such lovely lines. The Rottweilers, my God, that line really brought, made the hairs on my arm stand on end. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
this wonderful, wonderful poem. And as
Thank you,
somebody,
Sunil.
as one of our viewers is saying, it is just the poem for today.
Yeah, because it seems tragic that 7 decades and more into what was meant to be a space of emancipation, we seem to be ceding away more and more of our freedoms. And I cannot for the life of me understand, not only in this country, but in many countries, many societies across the world, I cannot understand the kind of insecurity that makes people narrow themselves, narrow their consciousness, narrow their imagination. I also cannot understand why majorities in all these societies who have never had anything snatched away from them seem to want to assume a history of being wronged, a so-called history of victimhood, and
Yes,
deny
yes,
the large spectrum of possibilities that should be the common human heritage. I think
absolutely.
we're in a struggle between people who treasure the kaleidoscopic, treasure all colors, and those who will themselves and others to be colorblind.
So true, so true. And it also seems to me there is a fear of the imagination itself, like you said, the
Absolutely.
kaleidoscopic imagination. There is a fear of the strange and unforeseen places that the imagination can take one. And there is a comfort
Absolutely.
in familiar if restricting notions of self and state, which
Absolutely.
is uh, which is exactly what in a sense uh, good poetry seeks to gently say, look, but have you thought of this? Have you thought of that? Have you thought of something else? You know, what are the possibilities? What are these possibilities? So poetry
Which
of
is why
possibilities.
that's beautiful. The poetry of possibility is really a form of resistance. This is what it is. But I'm also troubled by the way in which certain tones, certain forms of voicing, even simply in grammar, are vanishing. The subjunctive mode, for instance, the as it were, the what if, uh, a speculative cast of mind. We're actually giving away these things. They're actually going out of our language in the media, elsewhere. It's tragic that our language itself is being constrained, and our sense of language is also being constrained. This is all part of the same larger, I have to say, a larger agenda of constriction. Now, in a subcontinent like this, with its vastly many and diverse languages, I don't know why we are 7 decades down the line still arguing about one or another language. Why are we trapped in a binary logic of languages? Historically, we've all been multilingual. We've transited from
Absolutely.
one language to another, dependent on context.
Absolutely, absolutely. And this idea of the mother tongue and the dialect versus the standard language, that very, very risky and dangerous, culturally toxic terrain to go down,
Absolutely.
uh, seems to me fraught with dangers for our culture, really.
Absolutely, and it's different kinds of languages that are being endangered. I mean, on the one hand, of course, the canonical idea is that English is the great danger to all other languages. And as an Anglophone poet, I mean, I see that, but it's not the only danger. I think the idea of standard languages in various regions, that is equally, if not more dangerous. Also, the misperception of what a language is. The language, I mean, I've said this before, but it's it's a large bee in my bonnet. The language that we call Hindi is actually a relatively recent invention, and it has been imposed on a rich and vibrant continuum of languages, which includes Magahi, Bundeli, and at the other end also Urdu. I mean, if we go back 200 years, we'll find that these languages were called different things. They were also called Hindavi, Braj, Awadhi. These are languages with literatures. They're not dialects. And that word dialect really makes me see red.
Absolutely.
And not to mention languages that are spoken by subaltern groups, by marginalized and vulnerable groups, which will vanish under this kind of blunderbuss approach that we're taking to language, when in fact we should be celebrating these diverse languages.
Absolutely. And speaking of diverse languages, I remember that in many of your poems, and especially I think one from Jonah Whale, where you include seamlessly these lines from a Konkani song
Yes.
into your into the body of the poem, and
Right.
it all just fits into the overall cadence so beautifully. Do you remember that poem, and would you like to read it perhaps?
Absolutely, I'd love to do that. Also, in fact, when I was putting my set together for this evening, I was wondering whether I'd read a part of a poem called Heart or called Redburn, which has Bandish lines, or this one. But I'll read the one that you.
Whichever you want to. Please
No,
don't.
I'm happy to read this. No,
Oh,
it'll also take us into another space, the space of the cafe, which many of us have missed in these last many months. It's
yes.
called Open for Business, and it's set in I have to say, set in a Bandra cafe of the kind that I haven't seen since the end of March. Open for business. Newspaper bunched in hand. You're misting the door with Lysol, wiping the glass panels in wide arcs. But the man in the blue paisley bandana, who's whistling the opening bars of "Han Saiba Pol Tori Voita," isn't planning to get scrubbed off the menu. He's pushing through with a crate of eggs, his hands itching for whisk and skillet, the first Spanish omelette of the day. He's the dancer, sweet-talking the boatman into getting her across the river. You're a tightrope walker with a limp, nursing a sore throat. You spray the swinging air with soap.
Wow. Absolutely wonderful. And so we are at the 3/4 mark now. We just have
Okay.
about, but there's a good 12 minutes left for more
Okay.
poems. And why not have the Bandish poem too,
Oh my
if you like?
goodness. My friends and who are committed to Hindustani classical music, and there are a number of them, will kill me because in the course of this poem, I sort of murder Girja Devi and Siddheshwari Devi, who I love. But I'm going to give this a shot. It's a long poem, so I'm going to just read a part of it and see how this plays. It's called Redburn on Shore Leave, and the subtitle is Liverpool 1849. So it comes actually from one of Herman Melville's books. And this was the time when I was, of course, immersed in Moby Dick, and Jonah Whale is an extended dialogue with Moby Dick. And what I wanted to do also was to reflect on my particular readerly relationship with the canon of 19th century English literature. By English, I mean Anglo-American, and from anywhere else in the English-speaking world, and here. And I thought to myself, it's a common experience I think that many of us have had. Maybe this is more a generational thing and no longer prevails, but it certainly happened to people like me who went to school in the 70s, that you read something that was in the canon. It could have been Jane Austen or Dickens or Conan Doyle or whatever it was. And there was something in the narrative that, of course, seized you, and it was powerful and marvelous. But you realized that, especially when they talked of the colonies or the empire, that you were not really participating in that world. And that you, meaning us, were always characterized as the other, as the cannibal, as the Lascar, and so on and so forth. So what I've tried to do in some of the poems in Jonah Whale and in the Atlas of Lost Beliefs is really to address this, to maybe recapture some of these canonical works. So what I've done in this poem, Redburn on Shore Leave, is to really take up one of the chapters in the book, in Redburn, and to write over it, to erase some of the words. I'm also committed throughout this book to cut-ups and to bringing together dissimilar energies. So it's an overwriting, a set of erasures, and a set of insertions into Melville's text. So I'm going to read one or two parts with it. Like I said, it's a long poem. And also transits between prose and Bandish. Okay. Among the ships lying in Princess Dock, none interested me more than the Irrawaddy of Bombay, a country ship, the name Europeans gave to the large native vessels of India. 40 years ago, these merchantmen were nearly the largest in the world. They still are larger than most, built of teak, the oak of the East. Jetmase chunari rangai behorama. The Irrawaddy had just arrived from Hindustan with a cargo of cotton. She was manned by 40 or 50 Lascars, the native seamen of India, who were governed by a countryman of higher caste. While his inferiors went about in strips of white linen, this dignitary was arrayed in a red army coat, brilliant with gold lace, a cocked hat, and drawn sword, but the effect was spoiled by bare feet. Jetmase chunari rangaibe. His business flagellating the crew with the flat of a saber, an exercise in which long practice had made him expert. The poor fellows jumped away with a tackle rope, elastic as cats. O Rama. And I'll end the extract and leave you to imagine the rest and to imagine it really in Girija Devi's voice rather than mine.
Wonderful, wonderful. This so here the Bandish line becomes some sort of a. It becomes I don't know if the refrain is the right word to use here, but it becomes a textural element.
It is a textural element, but it also draws attention to the life world of the sailors.
Yes, yes.
Redburn is meeting. I mean, they're from India. They come
Yes.
often, I mean, not only do they come from the Konkan and Malabar coasts, but some of them also come from far inland. So histories of indenture and of really effectively slavery, but also a certain kind of transcontinental and transoceanic travel, all that is indicated. But these also are largely women's voices. Remember that the protagonists in the book and in the poem, therefore, are men. But these are the voices of the Kumri, the Kajri, the Cheti, and I hate that term, light classical music, which is a pejorative patriarchal term, because these compositions really speak of often of the loss and the longing of women. They also speak of juridical violence in the Gangetic Plain. My favorite example is this. There's another line, "Sayan ko le gaye thanedar," for instance.
Oh, yes.
The beloved has
Yes.
been taken away by the police, or they've often just been press ganged. So the romance of longing and distance and viraha also has another side to it. It also has this aspect of men being taken away, of being press ganged, of being indentured, taken away.
Yes, yes, yes.
So there's also a history of empire that is kind of surfacing through this overwriting and over-inscribing of the poem.
Absolutely, and empire is is the word
Indeed,
which provides us with a which is quite the word that comes to mind in the current times. But
yes,
I noticed that we are all that it's almost 6:50. So, and I'm sure that our audience has a lot of questions. So, can we have a question and answer round if you like?
Sure.
So, if there are any questions, please type them down. We can watch. We can see them as you type them live. Are there any questions for Ranjit?
I began as a Luddite who was incredibly fearful of Insta Live, and it took a lot of persuasion from Rana Safvi and you and Benita Agarwal and other friends to get on here. But now I'm merely scrolling through, so I find a question Alolika Dutt, who asks, what is Khadi Boli though? Khadi Boli is one of these languages in the language spectrum or language continuum that has today been sat on by an official Hindi. But what happened in the latter half of the 19th century is that the prevailing Braj and Awadhi ascendancy was pushed to one side by very influential grammarians and linguists who decided that Khadi Boli was a much more masculine base for a new Hindi, their word, not mine. So that's when the project of creating this new official Hindi, which was built on a Khadi Boli base and heavily Sanskritized with a lot of the Persian elements taken away, that's when this begins. So the Hindi that we know, the official Hindi, is about as recent as that. And it's always been depressing for me to think that languages like Braj and Awadhi are called dialects. I don't know what that means. They have flourishing literatures. And the other languages in that language spectrum also have literatures. They might be oral, they might be performative, but they're powerful and they're there, not to be simply pushed to one side. But are there other questions? And this is true in different parts of the country. I mean, this Hindi is the history that I know best, but it has definitely happened in other parts of the country too.
Absolutely. I remember also that the role of so-called, the conflation of a language with a regionality or shall we say
Yes.
a language with a son of the nativist sort of an identity.
Yes.
Doesn't really bear up when subjected to scrutiny. I remember your tweet made a few days ago about Marathi, in which this absolutely marvelous verse appears written by a Jesuit priest in place of Marathi.
That was Thomas Stevens,
the writer of the Krista Puran, if I'm not mistaken.
The Krista Puran, exactly. Yeah, it's 11,018 lines written in the Ovi stanzaic meter by a Jesuit who was born in Wiltshire and who came to the Ashtadoda, India. He came to Goa and settled there and brought with him Latin, Greek, and English. He learned Sanskrit, Portuguese, Konkani, and Marathi. And he launched off on this Purana, telling the story of Jesus using material from both testaments, from the Gospels, and loved the languages that he learned here. He fell in love with Konkani and with Marathi. So when you think of it, and he used the Ovi, which was very dear to the Vaishnav Bhakti poets who were his contemporaries and his neighbors, and he knew their work. So not only are we thinking of Marathi now as a trans-regional language, there's also a strong transcontinental link to this. Also in that rather productive exchange of tweets, I pointed out that some of the great centers of Marathi culture have actually been outside of the territory of Maharashtra, in Thanjavur, in Tamil Nadu, in Indore, which is in central India. So if we start thinking of our languages as mobile, trans-regional languages, you'll actually see their histories in a far richer way. You'll embrace them in a far more meaningful way. And it's a tragedy that children at school somehow feel that learning more languages is a great imposition. There can't be a better way of expanding your consciousness, because you're a slightly different person depending on which language you're speaking. You have a slightly different cultural framework. So that's a way of expanding your consciousness.
Absolutely so. And another way to do it is through translation.
Absolutely. And I think that it's... Sorry.
Of which you are a wonderful exponent, I must say, especially when it comes to the poetry of Lal Ded.
Well, thank you. I mean, that was for me a life journey. I mean, I've sometimes thought that more than a project, it is a project, but it also was a life journey for all kinds of reasons that you're familiar with. But I also am deeply reassured by the fact that a number of very fine poets are also committing themselves to translation. Just to think of a few people who are here with us this evening: Mustam Sirdalvi, Sampurna Chatterjee, Sarabjit Garcha, and a number of other poets, particularly in the 2 or 3 generations currently practicing. It's also a strong political commitment.
Absolutely. Language and politics and So we are almost out of time, but I'd like to thank you so much for giving us your time and reading out your work here today. And it's a pleasure as always to be hearing your poems read out aloud. It really brings a whole
Thank you.
different dimension to them. And I'd like
Oh,
to thank the people who joined this session today. Just to remind you, we are live roughly every fortnight. It's always on a Saturday and it's always at 6 p.m. So please follow PEN Prithvi and stay tuned for more events to be coming up. So with Ranjit's permission, I'll wind up the session.
thank
And
you so much, Suvit. It's really been wonderful to be in conversation with you. And I'd also like to thank everyone who's joined us this evening. Thank you.
so, folks, it's time to say bye now. So see you in the next session. Bye bye.
See you.